So when was the first time you ever came to Detroit?
When I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, I came to Detroit in 2002, and it was a pretty desolate place. It was a pretty,
It was one of our little economic downturns.
Well, I mean, I think the reality is it was a dysfunctional city, and it had all of the characteristics and features of a dysfunctional city. And when you work at a place like Ford and you work around the world, you can extrapolate from that. I mean, you can, on a micro level, it's what we see in dysfunctional developing world countries. I mean, I don't mean to be disparaging, but literally what I saw in Detroit was like what in the old days, in an un-PC way, we would say, like a dysfunctional third world government, a dysfunctional system, a dysfunctional private sector, and a dysfunctional public sector.
I think Ethan Davidson referenced that when he talked about trying to make grants years ago through the Pistons to do parks, and there just was no accountability, and the culture was so, it had no accountability built in, no pride.
Well, and I think the, part of the challenge of this city, because what I find remarkable about Detroit, among so many things, is that it embodies all that is amazing and remarkable about America, and it is also manifest of all of the contradictions and the things that confound us about America. In this city, in this one city, you see all of that play out. And for someone like me, it's one of the reasons I'm fascinated. All of the issues, race, class, geography, power, inequality, private sector, public sector, it's all of these things are playing out here in such a powerful and exciting way.
I think last night Steve Ballmer was talking about the idea that he would like to work on strategies to counter intergenerational poverty. One of the hardest problems, and certainly something that I think your foundation has worked at. Do you have any advice for him as he tackles this idea?
Well, Steve Ballmer doesn't need any advice from me. He's an incredibly successful person. I would suggest over the years, one of the things I have observed is that for many people who are committed deeply to these issues, they often are challenged to understand the centrality of race and class when they talk about poverty and intergenerational poverty, because there is a relationship there that often successful people just have a hard time dealing with, and I should be more explicit, successful white people, because for many people, particularly successful people, there is a desperate need to believe that we're a meritocracy because I'm successful and I started with nothing, or there's always a narrative that goes along with it. And in acknowledging these realities, we have to also then question how we were successful in a system. I mean, so this system produces many of us, including me, who are extraordinarily successful, certainly economically. And so when we see others who aren't, we don't naturally say there's something systemic going on here. There's something wrong with the system that produces these continued results intergenerationally, because we would then have to interrogate our own success, and we'd have to interrogate the system that produced us. And actually, the system really works for us. I mean,
You're a Head Start kid.
Well, but growing up poor, I started my life in a little, shotgun house in Ames, Texas, and thank God that Head Start lady came up on the porch and talked to my mother. But I have a level of of security and that I could never have imagined, and that certainly most people in my family and most people in Ames, Texas in 1965 would never have imagined. And so the system actually really works for me. It really does. And it works for most of my friends, because most of my friends are like me. They are people who are high income, urban, travel around the world a lot, and have the resources to make that possible for me and our kids and so the system actually works for me. But there's something really wrong, and I know that, even
Because
as a
it doesn't work for everybody.
because it doesn't work for enough people.
Right.
And so my response isn't to say, I want to help, these 25 wonderfully important, projects that matter in a neighborhood. I want to ask, why aren't 25,000? Why aren't 250,000? And that requires you to engage at a systemic level. And that's a very different kind of engagement as a philanthropist than saying, all right, I want to work with 25 kids, which is great. We need to work with those 25 kids. But that shouldn't let people like me off the hook from looking at these larger systemic issues.
Well, I think that's a good segue into the education piece that we want to talk about this morning, because for you and for many others, it was education that allowed social mobility and actually class, an ascent in class. So as you look at education and the work that you've done at the foundation, you heard from the interim superintendent a few minutes ago. We're going to have three people join us in a few minutes to talk about their own perspectives on education. But the bottom line is that the Detroit schools are the bottom of the barrel nationally in urban districts. What are there things that you have learned through the foundation work of what makes a difference? What can we do? What should we be doing to get to those 25,000 numbers or even more?
I think one of the things we have to do is get out of the binary construct that I think manifest in our body politic today. And that is to say that we have constructed these ideological walls across our entire society, and you must be on one side or the other. So you can't be for Black Lives Matter and for the police. You can only be for one. You can't be for charter schools and be for systems reform. Because if you are for charter schools, that means that you are against the larger systems. You can't be for the idea of repopulating and bringing in new residents, because that means you're against incumbent residents. And so we're in these binaries that define how we engage as a society, as a city, a community. And so for me, what philanthropy should do, and what I hope Ford does, is to recognize that actually problems get solved in the gray area. Problems actually don't get solved in the extremes, in the binaries, in the sort of ideological purity test kind of box. And so in education, we must get out of this binary, and we have to recognize the complexity, the drivers of why we're in the bottom, and engage in that and attack that with the ferocity that we've allowed these schools to atrophy. Because this is not what's happened in the schools is a symptom of a larger challenge in the region, a highly racialized, highly class, I think, sensitive region, it should come as no surprise, actually, that the schools would find themselves in this situation. And so in order to redress that, there has to be a kind of a reverse intensity of focus that recognizes the relationship between poverty, intergenerational poverty, and how we reverse those trends and recognize that, as I think Steve was saying last night, you can't have a focus just on the child and not understand their context. Because often what I find is that experts, and particularly people with deep credentialed knowledge, have very strong understanding and capacity around content. All the data, all the analytics, all the information. What they don't often fully understand is context. And so you must be excellent at both content and context. And what happens is, particularly, and I say this because I'm a part of, so much of my life is spent with a little conversation in my head about so many things, but this is one of those things because
you hear voices a lot, Darren,
absolutely. I do. I'm constantly having conversations with myself. And part of this is on this question of content and context. So when you work at a place like the Ford Foundation, you've got all these people with PhDs and understand macroeconomics, and you're at the World Bank and you're having these conversations about these remarkable trends in the data, and the PowerPoints are going, and it's so exciting. But that has to be contextualized. And often we who possess the credentialed, formalized understanding of an issue don't always appreciate what might be the uncredentialed, authentic knowledge of what goes on in communities. And so we don't integrate those perspectives fully into interventions. Mm-hmm. And then we're surprised when our interventions don't work. Mm-hmm. And that's been a lesson, certainly, of much of philanthropy. And part of that, I believe, is because of that. And again, part of the challenge is because context, certainly in the United States, but in our work in India, we could say it's caste and Dalits or ethnic minorities in East Africa or whatever. Context in the United States on these issues is often highly racialized and highly a function of class. And those of us who possess the power and have the authority in much of the design and the ways in which these interventions are crafted aren't really comfortable. I mean, I think it was interesting to me, I don't know about you, but it was interesting last evening because there were two questions at the dinner that to me were all about race. And race was never mentioned. And so
community.
When a person says, how do you think about the community? Can we just say what you're talking about? How do you think about black people fitting into strategies that you have for us? And so I think part of the challenge is that's the conversation we should be having, actually. And that's a really hard conversation to have. And so what I want us at Ford to be able to do is to make sure that we're modeling that conversation. And it's probably easier because, you've got me as president, and I don't mean easier in the sense of, but I think part of it is I was giving a talk somewhere recently, and we were having a conversation and I think part of what I was trying to say in that context was, this was a conversation with an African-American leader, and we were on a panel, and they were talking about safe space. This was in the context of universities renaming and all of the things going on at Yale and Princeton. And they said, well, we need to have safe space. And I said, we need to create safe space for white people. to talk about these things because for a lot of people, this is such a fraught topic. And because it is so uncomfortable and we engage in it in such a clunky, inelegant way, it's very hard. And the examples of people attempting to engage and using the wrong word or saying something.
People are afraid.
People are afraid.
Yeah.
I mean, so why don't we agree that just like I recently learned, I made all sorts of ignorant, stupid sort of remarks about people with disabilities because I didn't fully understand. It's possible that you might do the same thing about African Americans. And you're not a bad person for doing that. And you're not a racist because you do that. And I think we need to create the kind of space so that we can have those kinds of conversations. And that's what leaders should be doing. And that's where our leaders are failing us. Because our leaders want us to be in those binary boxes. They want us to be in boxes that say, you are either you get it, you understand, or you're a racist. You either support my position or you're against me. And so that's what our leaders are demanding of us today too often. And we as citizens have to say, we don't want that kind of leadership. We want a different kind of leadership. And I so admire Mayor Duggan because I think he is one of those kinds of leaders who is non-ideological. Could you just get the job done, please? And that's what we want. And we don't care. I'm not really concerned about your ideology. I just want you to do your job and serve.
Well, I think that my mind is going 90 miles an hour now. I have voices in my head thinking about the opportunity. You've kind of given Detroit a challenge and the region a challenge to have a constructive conversation, a real conversation. And I can't think of any better time than now when Detroit is doing better economically, that's the time to have the conversation because there are people who feel left out. You heard that last night. So this is a very good time, especially because we are looking at the 50th anniversary of 1967 next year.
Indeed.